Welcome to Solo Ship Week 3. This is Jam to Win. I'm Squirrel Patrol. Thanks for joining us. Jam, how was your week?
My week was all right. I had a profitable week, nothing big. What about you?
It was an interesting week. I won a FanDuel seat with my most expensive lineup, and if I hadn't won that, it would have been a bad week. Winning the qualifier makes it about neutral. I basically just bought the seat equity, which is better than spending the money and getting nothing. But it was an interesting lineup because I was kind of talking on the show last week about trying to get a running quarterback with some of the Raiders offense. And thankfully, what I landed on was Lamar Jackson with Devontae Adams and Josh Jacobs. And that lineup ended up winning. And it actually sparked a thing in my head. Like, I think the scoring system hasn't changed in a decade, but I think people are still undervaluing running quarterbacks. Maybe it's the quarterbacks that have changed, not the scoring system. But yeah, I was happy when Lamar Jackson broke off that 80-yard touchdown run.
Yeah, NFL's always changing, and if we're not accounting for that, well, like you said, the scoring doesn't change. So if we don't account for that, we really put ourselves behind. And speaking of that game, we had this last week at OWS, we had a member win the game changer. We had another member win the power sweep, another member win the secondary power sweep, another win the Yahoo baller. We had a bunch of top 10 finishes, another contest, and it was all around that game. And it wasn't so much about that game being a great game as just the theory behind, like, this is a game that can pop and that nobody's on. And this is a slate where there's not a lot of games that can pop. And so you just think from obviously what we're so focused on at OWS is like DFS theory, right? And training people how to think as DFS players. Well, if you think as a DFS player, you just find those spots where it's like, hey, who cares if it doesn't hit? You're going to lose most weekends anyway. If it does hit, though, this is the spot that could change the slate, right? And so you build around it fully. And then like first down, right? Take down a qualifier, you have to finish first. It's first or nothing. And it's one of those spots where it's like people aren't on this one. And so when it hits, you're there.
Yeah. It's funny you say that because it was actually a mega qualifier and I finished second. but yeah, for the theory is mostly right. And it was interesting because I was the only person in that entire qualifier that had Lamar Jackson. It was the $5,000 FanDuel qualifier, like mega qualifier. And I had Lamar Jackson, and I was the only one with him in the entire qualifier. And so when he broke off that 80-yard run, I'm like, well, I guess I'm going to Marco Island. But two people actually had Tua, and so that got it really close. And so like one of the guys with Tua ended up in first, the other ended up in third, which is like a $10,000 payout, which isn't bad at all. And I ended up with the second place, which also wins a qualifier seat. But I was thinking like that 80-yard touchdown run. Like, and you're not going to see that every week, but that's like Derek Carr throwing a 250-yard touchdown pass. Like, it's the same scoring. And yeah, so when he broke off that run, I'm like, and Lamar Jackson averages like 60-something yards, rushing yards per game. And people don't realize that's like an extra, 150 yards in passing. So yeah, but I was glad that I was able to get it second, even though a couple of people had Tua, who threw for 460 yards and like 6 touchdown passes, and still got outscored by Lamar Jackson.
The power of and I think too, players change, teams change. One of the things like Dak Prescott used to be a running quarterback. Russell Wilson used to be a running quarterback. These guys don't run as much. Kyler stopped running as much last year, but there are other guys, Lamar and Jalen Hurts being the two main examples, who and Trey Lance probably would have been this, who their rushing is like what their game is built around. And so they're not moving away from that. You can continue to take advantage of that. And also to things we've talked about in this show so far, people get tighter with that single entry or with those higher dollar contests. And so this Lamar and Miami and Baltimore game over under was kind of between 43 and 44. And so people don't want to pull the trigger on that with their high dollar buy-in, which kind of leaves you being the only person playing Lamar in a spot like that, which is, it's plus EV over time. If you could be the only person playing Lamar week in and week out, you're going to make money over time, regardless of matchup. You don't have to think about matchup. You just throw him in there every time that you're the only person with him, you're going to make money.
Yeah, it's actually, like, mentioning that, I wonder if there's a correlation between quarterback contracts and rushing yards by that quarterback, right? Because like Lamar's still rushing, but like some of the guys and like Jalen Hurts is still on his rookie contract, I think, and he's running all the time. But like once the team makes a huge dollar investment, maybe they don't want the guy running, running around the
Well,
field.
and I think that these guys too, they want to develop into like a full quarterback, right? And they know that when they're 30, 31, 32, they can't just outrun everybody the way they can early in their careers. So it's like, oh, well, I have to develop. But, if you can maximize, Patrick Mahomes in his post-game presser this last week called himself, he said something about being a running quarterback. Then he corrected himself. He goes, no, I'm not a running quarterback. He's like, I'm a quarterback who can run. And I think that's how a lot of these guys see themselves, right? It's like, I want to be a quarterback who can run as opposed to a running quarterback. Whereas Lamar and Hurts, it's like, that's their spot in the NFL, is being a running quarterback. And just so much more powerful than some of these other spots. Because like you said, that's like Derek Carr throwing for a 250-yard touchdown pass. If you get an 200-yard touchdown pass, you get an 80-yard touchdown run.
Yeah, and I think this might be something that I aim to do in like single entry and qualifiers and in my tournament lineups, is be overweight the running quarterbacks paired with the receiving pieces from other high scoring games. So like if I think this week, you're going to see like Josh Allen be really popular, and he's a quarterback that obviously can run the ball, but maybe pairing him with a cheaper rushing quarterback and then also having Stephon Diggs. And try to get like more rushing points than Josh Allen, while still getting the receiving yards from Diggs, and maybe trying to, because like last week I used Lamar Jackson, I'm pairing him with Devontae Adams, like maybe try to keep that strategy going as something, because you're getting lower owned running quarterbacks, and if they're cheaper, especially you're able to pair them with the higher end receiving options. That lineup also had Cooper Kupp in it, which was he wasn't as high owned as I thought he would be, and he seems like he's going to be a cheat code again the whole season.
I love that. Kupp was obviously cheaper on FanDuel relative to the salary cap than he was on DraftKings last week, but and so on DraftKings he was 7% owned in at least in the Game Changer, and Devontae Adams was 50% owned. Like Kupp was a priority for me there. I think we talked about this last week about just that, yes, you have to spend an extra $1,300 in salary, but you're also buying this massive gap in ownership, because you're getting this guy who everybody wants to play him, but they're so salary conscious that they're like, well, but I'm not going to play Cooper Kupp. We talked about that in terms of Kyler Murray. Like he was a little bit more expensive, so people weren't going to play him, and they were down on that team. But if you pay just that little bit extra, you get that lower ownership. And I'm always happy to pay a little bit extra. Jonathan Taylor is a guy like that this week. He's going to be 5, 6, 7% owned, more expensive than these other guys, but he can go out there and put up a score that the other guys maybe can't touch this week and be the piece that you needed to have. This week's interesting because we have so many good spots. And so it's very different from last week, where this one lower total game could blow up and no other game is matching it. I think this is the sort of week where you kind of have to account for the fact that multiple games could hit, and you want to try to get pieces from those multiple games, but then there's not a lot of good salary savers available. So any unique perspectives you have on how to approach a week like this?
Yes, I was actually thinking about this earlier, and it not just in terms of the number of games that could go off, but as actually in terms of the salary savers. I think we're transitioning into the point of the season where injuries are starting to pile up, and we're starting to see more and more game time decisions. And it looks like there's actually going to be a handful of game time decisions. And we're recording this 3:30 on Friday, but I think James Conner is a game time decision, Julio Jones game time decision, and those are going to be interesting pieces because they're in the late games. And I think Conner especially, I think there's a couple of cheap running backs on Arizona where you could maybe plan on Conner being out and hope that that you're getting a value piece there that's not readily apparent earlier in the day. So we each week we kind of do content on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, and we don't know what to do with these questionable players. So we kind of assume everybody's going to be in, and that there's not a lot of value. But then week one, I was looking at Greg Dortch, early in the week, right? Like early on Sunday morning. It's oh, suddenly there's these value pieces. And then it was Lazard's out. Randall Cobb is a possibility at 3,000. And Green Bay had a couple of sub 4,000 wide receivers. And I actually think value might open up, on Sunday, and maybe even not by 1:00 on Sunday, but maybe by 4:30, and being able to late swap those lineups, maybe going a little bit overweight those later games that actually are probably the higher scoring anyway, and being able to swap in some pieces, like say like James Conner's out, and like I think Williams is just Darrell Williams, right?
Yeah.
Is the possible or Benjamin. But like just seeing what happens there if Connor's out, like if Julio Jones is out, then maybe you've got like Russell Gage or maybe even Scotty Miller as like a cheap value piece that you can put in, and then you're able to afford like a Cooper Kupp or a Jonathan Taylor.
Yeah, well, I got one statement for you and then one question for you. So one statement is on the Tampa one of the ones that Mike Johnson, one of our contributors at OWS, he texted me the other night about playing Rashad Perriman and Scotty Miller together, right? They combined for 7.7K in salary. And if Julio's out, reasonably speaking, Russell Gage is currently showing pretty high projections in ownership because he's kind of the guy that you're like, oh, he'll get the targets. And I don't know where the targets will go elsewhere, but even if Brady throws just another 27 to 30 passes, it's pretty reasonable that you see 10 to 13, maybe even 15, 16 targets for Perriman and Scotty Miller. And you can kind of look at it instead of as individual players, you look at it as like a 7.7K block in salary, as if you're buying a 7.7K wide receiver who's maybe not as talented as the other 7.7K wide receivers, but has a really high locked in target share. And like you said, with Julio lining up as a game time decision, probably comes in with lower ownership. So that's the thought. The question I have then is on a spot like Darrell Williams and Eno Benjamin, where they're cheaper, but they're not like that much cheaper. How do you look at that when you're saying like, it's just obviously ownership comes into play, but it's just like a few $100s more for Miles Sanders or David Montgomery, like guys with real legit roles where we know where the touches are going. And the savings aren't that great. What do you do in a situation like that? Do you value the low ownership and the small savings more than you value the certainty on a single entry, or would you be likelier to kind of look for that salary savings elsewhere?
So I think it depends site to site, and it depends like cash or tournament, and it depends. It depends how that individual lineup is doing already in the day. If it's a guy in the late games, I do think that Williams is much cheaper on FanDuel, and he might be a much better FanDuel play because I think he's sub 5,000, which is rare. You see a sub 5,000 running back on FanDuel who could be viable. I think he's like 4,900. And then there's an interesting situation because I think the Falcons have a rookie running back. I'm going to butcher his name.
Tyler Algier.
Tyler Algier, yeah. So he's probably going to see some work no matter what, and he's also sub 5,000. And so I actually like the idea of maybe trying to plug in for smaller field single entry, like having a 4,900 late game running back and just going with whoever looks like the best option between Williams and Algier and anybody else that pops up during the day. And because I think running back might just be a wasteland this year. And that's something we haven't wrapped our heads around, that because we're so used to like the Christian McCaffrey and Jonathan Taylor is great. And he was great last year, but it might just be all like the NFL might have really just transitioned to all receptions and particularly on DraftKings. Like there might not be running backs worth paying up for, spending sub 5,000 on a running back on FanDuel might end up being the way to go going forward. If there's a guy that's going to see any work and has any shot at a touchdown, like you might be able to then spend up at the receiving positions and get these guaranteed receptions and touchdowns, which is not something we would have thought of 5 years ago.
Yeah, and it is something like 8 years ago that we would have done, because 8 years ago, all the high-priced running backs were the Adrian Petersons who didn't catch passes, and it was like, why are you paying up for these guys in PPR and half PPR when you can get these cheaper guys who are going to get you 20 points, and you guys are paying 8,500 for Adrian Peterson's maybe 25 to 27 points, and then the NFL changed, as we said, like NFL changes, and David Johnson came along, and Le'Veon Bell came along, and then all these other teams tried to copycat that with Alvin Kamara and Christian McCaffrey and Saquon Barkley and all these guys they developed, and then these workhorse big contract guys started getting hurt, and now teams have started going back heavily toward this 65-35. Najee Harris, Christian McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley, right now Leonard Fournette. Like these are the only guys that pay 80% of the snaps, and every other lead back is kind of a 65% back. And so I do think that it's interesting to think about where people get too locked into the position where they're paying up or down as opposed to what's actually available, right? And I think about it like when I came into MLB DFS and I didn't know, the only team I knew well was the Red Sox. And so I didn't have biases on all these other players. And so I was just naturally contrarian on an almost daily basis by letting the numbers and the slate tell me where to go. And everybody else has their preconceived notion about these players. And I think that that's also something we're seeing. And, I came into DFS and at a time where people were paying up at running back. And I was like, what are you all doing? You're just giving me free money. Like I'm taking a 5K running back every week at both spots. And I think that, now that we've been in the game for so long, it's easy for us to be like, okay, this is the way we allocate salary at this position and this position. And I do agree with you. Like I've messed around a lot more this season with cheaper running back builds, or even like last week, Mike was high on Nick Chubb, right? Where typically on a PPR site, we're not high on a player who's so touchdown dependent. But then if you think like, yeah, but running back as a whole is pretty ugly, and this guy is going to be lower owned because of the way that we look at this position, then you get a chance to gain some edges there. So yeah, and I like that thought too about the running backs, the value of these guys on FanDuel, where A, it's more touchdown dependent, and B, they're costing less of the salary cap than they are over on DraftKings. And another guy, I'll throw out another guy for you, Rashad Penny. Rashad Penny's going to come in at like sub 1% ownership, and they're playing at home in a game that they could actually control. And let's say that Seattle gets 35 rush attempts, right? It's going to be like 22 to Penny and 13 to Kenneth Walker. And we've seen what Penny can do on 20 plus carries. I think he's an interesting tournament play this week. And again, if you can let go of, you're going to pay $5K for a wide receiver who's got a range of like 5 to 30 points. So why not pay for a running back who has a range of 5 to 30 points and then allocate your salary differently in the field?
Yeah, I think Seattle's going to be an interesting offense this year because I think people don't want to play them, and they're going to be super cheap. Like Geno Smith, this guy I referenced last week. I mean, yeah, he's like 5,000 at quarterback, and he's a guy that can get some rushing yards. I'm like 5,000 at quarterback. If you're picking up some rushing yards and you get a touchdown pass or two, and with the salary, what else you can spend on with that lineup, like that's going to be a very unique construction because nobody's going to play Geno Smith. And yet, I think Penny's the same way. Like he's a running back, and he's the focal point, of the ground game for Seattle. This isn't a situation where we're necessarily worried that, it's going to split carries, is going to come out and, for half the game. Like, yeah, why? But like nobody's going to play Rashad Penny just because we all expect the Seattle offense to be terrible this year because there's no Russell Wilson. Yeah,
nobody's going to play DK Metcalf, and DK Metcalf has 3 really strong games in Geno's 6 starts. Tyler Lockett has 2 really strong games in Geno's 6 starts. So I have a question for you. I've kind of shared my thoughts on this on another podcast, and so I'll get to my thoughts after I ask you your thoughts. So let's say this week where we've got all these high total games, right? Let's say you're stacking a game that's not Buffalo. You're stacking a different game, and you have an either or between Gabe Davis and DK Metcalf, and they're both about the same price, 6,300, 6,100. And currently they're both projected for similar ownership. Do you have something that tilts you in one direction or the other in an either or like that?
So they're both the late game, right? I know Seattle's
DK's the late game and Gabe Davis is early.
Okay, so I got to make the decision kind of going in. I'm probably going to look at the total. I mean, I guess it's single entry and say that lineup's not a stack of either of those games.
Right.
I think Gabe Davis isn't going to, because Gabe Davis is on the injury report. Is he questionable or is he definitely?
I mean, I think we'll know more today, but I think he's been trending toward coming in.
Okay.
Yeah. And I mean, like 100%, healthy.
Like generally I'd want to go with the lower owned guy. And so if they're, and I think DK Metcalf is going to be lower owned than Gabe Davis. Like Gabe Davis has the kind of advantage of having the questionable tag. So maybe people are starting to think about their lineups and they're not, they don't want to count on Gabe Davis because he's questionable. So we don't know if he's going to play. So that can drive down ownership a little bit. But I also think like DK Metcalf's not going to be as high owned as Gabe Davis. If we know they're both.
No, yeah, that seems reasonable. But also the first thing you said was you would look at the total, which was kind of my thought was like, if they are projected for the same ownership, right? If we get to Sunday and it still looks like that. No matter how much I like the fact that nobody's playing DK Metcalf, I'd have to be like, okay, yeah, but which offense is likely to score like 5 touchdowns and get 2 or 3 touchdowns for their pass catcher, and then you throw Gabe Davis in there, and then if he starts getting up the like numbers I said was like if he starts getting up to like 8% owned, 10% owned, and DK still sitting down here at 2% owned, 3% owned, then it's like, well, I don't care that Gabe Davis is in the better game environment. This guy's 2% owned, and I just have this shot to kind of move past everybody.
Yeah, there's a thought also that Stephon Diggs might be one of the higher owned wide receivers. So I think Josh Allen's going to be very highly owned. Stephon Diggs is going to be highly owned. So actually, Gabe Davis could be a pivot, right? Like where everybody's expecting Stephon Diggs to get all the points, and then if Gabe Davis catches 2 touchdown passes and Diggs doesn't, then has just an average game or a little bit of a subpar game with no touchdown receptions, then you could be vaulting a bunch of lineups. But I think
exactly, yeah. It's like you're getting if he stays at like lower projected ownership, even like sub 5%, right? You're getting the guy with the higher game total, and he's direct leverage off of somebody. He's not just like an isolated piece that could have a big game. He's taking away points from other rosters. But yeah, both those guys are interesting this week, especially DK Metcalf, because we know his ownership's not going to go up. But if Gabe Davis's ownership projections stay down, I think that there's a lot of interesting elements to consider there as well. Have you looked at ownership much for this week so far?
A little bit. Like I did my RotoGrinders content this morning, so I was looking at ownership. There's a bunch of questions right on the survey.
You've seen Irv Smith is like highest projected owned tight end so far.
I don't know about that. That's fine with me. I would be totally okay with that. Because I think there's some good tight ends on the slate, right? I'm a big Travis Kelce fan. Like I think I said last week, I think he's always going to be the guy that I end up the most overweight on in my DFS career, just because like Irv Smith could get shut out. Like Irv Smith might not score any points. So I know Cousins is going to be popular. I think he's showing as one of the more popular quarterbacks. I don't like that. Like I'm very happy because like Cousins isn't going to get any rushing yards at all. And like that game might not. Like the Minnesota side might not score as well for DFS as the implied point total, right? I think Minnesota has one of the highest or the highest implied point total, so that's going to make Minnesota guys popular. But it might just be all Dalvin Cook, and Dalvin Cook's really expensive. Like you might not need pieces from that game, which is going to surprise people, right? Because like Justin Jefferson's also really expensive, and then Adam Thielen I think is going to be one of the more popular guys because he's a really good value. So yeah, I'm probably going to end up under with the field on Irv Smith if he ends up being the most popular tight end.
Yeah, and I think that we're in this week where there's just not a lot of savings available, and so people look at tight end as like a place where they can always save salary. And Irv Smith had a nice game the other night, scored the touchdown, so the fantasy score looks really nice, and so then people want to gravitate toward that. I mean, we're still early, right? But right now it's looking like Kelce's going to be one of the most under-owned elite players on the slate because people are like, well, I don't know where to save salary. And so they're just going down at tight end. But it's like, what if Scotty Miller bombs, if Mac Hollins bombs, you're still like not that far behind what Irv Smith probably gets at a similar price point. And now you have the flexibility to pay up for Kelce at tight end where other people aren't able to go there.
Yeah. And I mean, I've got a guy at tight end tagged that like does Arizona have any wide receivers yet? Like all those guys are still out. Like Rondale Moore's out.
Yeah.
Like AJ Green's maybe not. Maybe
toast.
Like barely in. Like Zach Ertz. Like I compare. Now I got tight end filled. I compare him with my running quarterback and Kyler Murray, who's going to showing like sub 5% ownership. It's a high point total game. I don't know why more people aren't going to be playing that. But yeah, you all can have like your Kirk Cousins and Irv Smith lineups, right? I'm gonna take Kyler Murray and Zach Ertz, and I'm gonna find some savings somewhere, right? And it might be with some running back that might not be starting as of 1 p.m. But I think I'm gonna find the savings somewhere. I think savings is gonna start to pop up as we get farther into the NFL season on Sundays, and some of these game time decisions end up not playing.
I think you speak to a good point there in two areas. One, people like to kind of form their decisions earlier, and so they don't like having to wait for things. And as you also noted earlier, like most of the content doesn't really cover these guys who are going to be filling in when somebody else is out. And then on top of that, the willingness to look at the upside of plays instead of like the range of outcomes of plays, right? Like I think that it's so easy for people to be like, yeah, but if this guy misses, or like what if the Cardinals offense looks bad again? And it's like, well, and I think that's one of the great things about being qualifier heavy in your play. And that was how I started DFS. Like the first 2 weeks I played cash games and tournaments. And then for like 2 months straight, the only thing I played was qualifiers. And it gears you toward this willingness to be like, oh yeah, but I don't care what happens in the down scenario. I just care what happens in the up scenario. So you're saying like, why aren't people on this Kyler Murray game? Well, I'll tell you one reason is because like the chalk forms most heavily from whatever ETR is talking about. And I say that because like a lot of the DFS content providers are DFS players, right? So like still grinding MLB at this time of year. It's about to be grinding NBA. And so you don't have like time to do all the research yourself. And Adam and Evan are always going to be really sharp on like who the sharpest plays are. But Adam's like one of the best cash game players. And so he'll talk about a player because like, well, this guy's got a good floor and he's safe and he can also hit for like higher end points. But then like the chalk congregates so heavily on those types. So it's not just Adam and Evan, but like that's where a lot of the industry thoughts kind of flow from, are those two guys. It's been that way before they started ETR, obviously. It's been that way for years. But it's like people then congregate on these plays that are being talked up because they're good cash game plays, essentially, not because they're the highest ceiling plays. And then everybody kind of holds on to that in tournaments. They have a hard time being like, okay, this guy could actually like I wouldn't play this guy in cash game because he's a little too high priced for his floor or whatever the case is, but the ceiling is still so much higher. And I think that that's an edge is people just think way too much about the safety of a player and like the cash game viability of a player without even realizing that that's what they're talking about when they're talking about tournaments.
Yeah. And it's actually, it kind of transitions into the last position we haven't talked about, which is defense, right? Because that was the big almost controversy on Twitter, that the Bengals defense, like you couldn't really make an argument against the Bengals defense on DraftKings last week. Like it was the clear best value for a defense, but we were on the show last week talking about it and saying like, yeah, you got to go underweight the Bengals defense.
100%.
And people were looking on the Millie Maker and looking at some of the people that maxed out the Millie Maker on DraftKings and what percentage of the Bengals defense did they play. And because it was 40% owned, which is crazy. Like there's no reason a defense should be 40% owned in a Millie Maker. I think it was like 2,200 and they were facing a backup quarterback. But like we said, like, yeah, that could mean Dallas just runs the ball all week or, all game. And then they, the Bengals don't get the opportunity for those sacks and turnovers.
Yeah. And I mean, I ended up with the Jaguars last week because it's just like, I'm not predicting they're going to have a better game. I just know that they're going to have a better game than the Bengals, more than what they like. Jags like 2% owned. They're going to have a better game than the Bengals more than 1 out of every 20 times. And so if this defense is this highly owned, going different, that's like the first defense that stood out to me this week was the Panthers. And then I had to immediately be like, okay, that probably means I'm not playing the Panthers this week because if they're the first defense that stands out to me, they're probably the first defense that stands out the field. Doesn't mean they're a bad defense. It just means that they're not like that much better than the other viable defenses, and they're going to be that much higher owned. So you just have to find ways to be different in a position like that.
Yeah, but like they were a good cash game defense, right? In my cash games, I'm playing the Bengals defense, but in tournaments, like I'm trying to vault that 40% of the field with any defense that could possibly put up more points. I ended up with like 8% of the Bengals defense, and I actually was kind of angry at myself that I didn't go lower. I guess in retrospect, it's obvious. I should have played 0. But they, I think they had one of the lower defensive scores on the slate, and they, and there were so many teams like the Buccaneers, I think, put up 20 some points. I will say there's a defense for playing the Bengals defense in tournaments, which is they were at least cheap. So like you're not spending up for high ownership. You're at least spending down for high ownership, and anything could have happened. And that's the thing. Like the defensive scoring is so almost random that you just don't want to. There's an argument for not spending a lot of money on your defense, no matter what. The problem is some of the high price defenses then can go off and get beat a team that gets 20 points or 18 points from the defense, and that's And that ends up being the defense you had to have to win a tournament.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And the, like you said, it's the fact that there's 40% of the field that has them, right? That's what matters more than any projection and more than anything else, is just if you can vault over that 40% of the field. I mean, last week there were these 40 to 50% ownership chunks all over the place that you could vault over: Devontae Adams and Saquon Barkley. And we'll see the same thing this week, right? It's people can't envision how a spot can fail if everybody's on that spot. But then you have to say, like, there's a difference between, we don't even have to know how a spot could fail. We didn't need to describe how Devontae Adams could fail. We just need to know that that's in the range of outcomes for any NFL player except for like Cooper Kupp, right? Like any NFL player can disappoint in any given matchup because the opponent is trying to take away that player as well. And so, yeah. And so if we can say, like in tournaments, let's let everybody else focus on the cash game plays. And sure, like some of them will sprinkle onto our lineups or maybe even have as a focus, because you don't have to be contrarian in every spot, but let other people chase those cash game plays in tournaments. And then we can find the plays that are just as good or even better with higher ceilings. And the people just aren't on them because they're so boxed into this optimal play mindset.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's our show, right? Like that's the show, is these cash game plays are going to end up overplayed in tournaments. That leads to outlandish ownership, like 40%, on a defense. And like, yeah, that defense is not going to hit 40% of the time. You want to take the next defense, the next best defense, and actually for defense, like take one that's maybe a little bit farther down the list, because a lot of people just go to the next best play. I couldn't even get away from Devontae Adams last week in most of my lineups, like in a lot of my tournament lineups. And we were talking about it on the show, he's going to be really highly owned, but it's just, he's going to get targeted so much. And I mean, he had a fine game, but he didn't have that tournament breaking game that you are looking for in single entry. Like I couldn't get away from him in my single entry lineups. But I think that's the emphasis of the show. And like, you have to be willing to lose your money. Like if you lose by a little bit, that's the same amount of losing as if you're in dead last place, right? So put in that lineup that has some low ownership, it's okay to play some good plays, some obvious plays, some high owned plays, but then you want to have some of those guys that are single digit ownership that have the upside to win a slate and win a single entry tournament.
Yep. Yeah. And a Cubs fan always called it the barbell approach. You're like either all the way to the left or all the way to the right, and if you're kind of always in the middle, then you're probably never going to finish in first place because you're just not doing enough differently to put you in that position. If you're finishing in last place with like plays that you can look at and say, yeah, these plays have upside, you're playing DFS correctly, because last place means that you were totally different from everybody else. Like you were different enough that you could finish behind every other roster. And there's value in that because that means you're different enough to finish ahead of every other roster as well.
Yeah, this is actually a thing on Roto Tracker. A lot of high volume players use this software called Roto Tracker that tracks your DFS entries, and you actually can graph your finishing position across tournaments. And a lot of times it ends up with that U shape, right? Like you're actually aiming for having very few lineups right in the 50% range. You want a lot of lineups that are either in the top 1% or the bottom 1%, right? Like those bottom 1% lineups, like as long as you remember to submit something, right? You're losing just as much money as if they finished in the 50% mark, because like 50% in tournaments isn't paying. So like you actually want that U shape of those lineups that either absolutely hit or absolutely fail. And it's one of the reasons I think people, stacking has become very popular in NFL tournaments, right? Because you want those games that take off. Like actually, I was kind of kicking myself because with the lineups from last week where I used Lamar Jackson or I used Tua, I paired generally with 2 wide receivers from that game or 2 pass catchers from that game. Like I should have been going with 3, right? Like I should have had Andrews, Tyreek Hill, Bateman, and Jalen Waddle as well. Like you could have sacked that game with 4 pass catchers, and that's the kind of lineup that's going to end up in either the top 1% or the bottom 1%. And last week, those ended up in the top 1%.
100%. Yep. You got to be willing to lose. I love it.
Yep. All right. So that's the show for this week. JM, any final thoughts?
No, always fun hanging out. Appreciate you having me on. We'll see you guys back here next week. We'll see you at the top of the leaderboards this weekend.
Yeah. See you next week.